I want to take a little bit of time today to talk about Charlotte, but beyond Charlotte, to talk about Milwaukee, Chicago, Ferguson, all the various places that we've seen things that are very disturbing, and to try to put them in a bigger, deeper context. Let me say, first of all, I don't believe that any civilization can tolerate rioting and looting. And in that sense, I think we have to establish a pattern that we're going to be much more prompt when you do have people who are breaking the law, who are violating other people's private property. I mean, if you looked at the scenes last night, why should some local storekeeper who might have been white or black or Asian or Hispanic, why should that storekeeper have their store destroyed just because some irresponsible elements decided they would use the excuse of getting together in order to loot and rob? So I think, first of all, let's establish a principle that we as a country are not going to tolerate looting. We're not going to tolerate rioting. We're going to draw a sharp distinction between peaceful demonstrations within the framework of free speech and utterly irresponsible activities. Part one. Part two, every shooting has to be investigated. But let's do it in a context of honesty. First of all, the number one threat to young African Americans is not the police. The number one threat is, sadly, tragically, other African Americans. Look at Chicago, where 3 people have been killed since a killing in Charlotte aroused so much tension. The fact is, we've had over 3,000 shootings in Chicago so far this year, about 1 every 2 hours, over 500 killings this year. We've had more people killed in Chicago, more Americans killed in Chicago since Barack Obama took office than died in the same period in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. And yet we're paying no attention to it because it doesn't fit the media narrative and the left's narrative. The left's approach was captured by Hillary Clinton, who said, well, here's somebody else added to the role of people the police killed. Now, if you think about that language, it is utterly, totally irresponsible. The fact is, the police didn't go around killing this guy. He apparently had a gun. He got out of the car. He was waving the gun. And we now know they have video that shows this. Now, it's true that a member of his family said he didn't have a gun, and that was carried by the news media as if the police had one story, but the family member had another story. But think about that for a second. The family member wasn't there. How did they know whether or not he had a gun? And now it turns out, after 2 days of rioting, that once again, the news media, with maximum irresponsibility, presented a false image and a false narrative, just as they did in Ferguson. And it turns out that, in fact, this was a real problem. But there's something deeper going on, and that's what I want to focus on. Not the individual acts, not the individual shootings, but when you look at the level of anger, it's legitimate. It's legitimate for 2 very different reasons. First, it's legitimate because the black experience in America has been harder. It has been more difficult. We've had slavery, segregation, now discrimination. Remember, segregation was the use of the law of the government to impose totally different standards. It wasn't voluntary. It wasn't just society. You had sheriffs and state police and some occasions National Guard. If you've seen the movie Selma, you have some idea of just how difficult and how challenging the problems were. And those are all in my lifetime. So it's not like this is some distant history story. Now, speaking of history, let me say I am delighted, and I believe in the long run it's a very important step, that the Museum of African American History is opening in Washington as part of the Smithsonian this weekend. This Saturday is the opening event. And I think that'll be good because it will both reintroduce African Americans to their own history, and it will introduce other Americans, white, Latino, Asian, to the history of millions of people who were, in fact, suffering in ways that no other group in America suffered. So that's a genuine, legitimate grievance. In addition, if you are a poor African American living in a big city, the odds are pretty good that you're in a neighborhood where the school doesn't work, you're in a neighborhood where there are no jobs, you're in a neighborhood where people who want to commit violence are in many ways dominant, where the police aren't very effective. So you don't have safety, you don't have a job, the school you're supposed to go to doesn't teach you, so your future's pretty grim. Now, I'm not surprised that people confronting that are angry. Their local elected officials don't get anything done. All they do is use demagoguery, yell racist, and try to avoid responsibility. But they don't fix the problems. Their state governments haven't fixed the problems. Their federal government hasn't. In fact, one of the great tragedies historians will look at in this period is we've had the first African American president for almost 8 years, and relations between the races are worse. We've had 2 African American attorney generals over the 8 years. And yet, even though at the very top, African Americans had powerful representation, that representation didn't launch a program to help the inner cities. It didn't launch a program to stop crime. And in fact, it did the opposite. You have a president who routinely took the wrong side factually, reinforced the wrong story, blamed the police. And this is part of a tradition on the left. Hillary Clinton, after all, when she was a student at Yale, was an associate editor of a newspaper, which was a left-wing radical paper, which was anti-police, characterized in cartoons the police as pigs. When she left Yale Law School, she went to California to work for a law firm whose specialty was defending Black Panthers in fights with police. So Hillary has a long tradition of being on the left and assuming if something happens, it must be the police's fault. This makes it harder to establish safety. And remember, Hillary Clinton was born in Chicago, where there have been 3,000 shootings this year. Barack Obama represented Chicago in the state legislature and in the Senate, and neither of them has made any special effort to try to solve the problems of Southside Chicago. So how would you solve them? Well, first, it turns out that liberals prefer ideology, and they prefer their interest group allies to actually helping poor people. So, for example, we know that in most of these big cities, the schools just don't work. They're bureaucracies. The one thing they do successfully is pay people, but they don't teach people. In Baltimore, the average 8th grade test, 13% of the 8th graders were passing their math exam. 13%. That means 87% were failing. But no change because the teachers union wouldn't tolerate it. In Detroit, 9% of the 3rd graders were able to read. 9%. That means 91% couldn't. But you couldn't reform it. The teachers union wouldn't tolerate it. Milwaukee's the same way. Chicago's the same way. And this is what this means. That people like Hillary Clinton, who are totally backed by the teachers union, can't be for school choice, can't be for the parents having the right to go to a good school, have to believe in trapping children in schools that don't work, even though in the modern era, if you don't learn how to read, you don't know how to write, you don't know how to do math, you're not going to get a job. If you don't get a job, you have no future. And so you say, well, at least we'll give you food stamps and public housing, and we'll give you a little money on disabilities. That's not a life. That's a maintenance. I'm going to be at Brookings today, Brookings Institution, talking about welfare reform, which we passed back in 1995. And we're going to be talking about how we finally got it signed in 1996, 20th anniversary. And the fact is, part of the key to what we were trying to accomplish was to reestablish work as being at the heart of the American system. You see, the most important social program you can have is a job. Because if you have a job, you have dignity, you have income, you have a chance to learn the skills for a better future. You might get a better job. But if you don't have a job and can't get a job and don't have any skills and can't earn your own way, life's pretty limited. You've been denied the opportunity to pursue happiness, which was written into our Declaration of Independence. So there are a great number of people who are trapped. They're trapped because the big cities are very expensive because they have so many bureaucrats. And so they have very high taxes. So it's very hard to build a factory or very hard to open a business. They have tons of regulations and red tape. It is astonishing how long it can take to be able to get something done in these cities where the bureaucracy governs and controls everything. We have a friend who's been trying to expand his restaurant to include a pizzeria, and he has had like 9 months of bureaucratic nonsense to finally get a permit to add a pizzeria to a restaurant. And that's typical. The result is it's very hard to create small businesses in the inner city, very hard to get through all the paperwork, and there are very few jobs. Finally, I think it's important to recognize that we know how to police. Rudy Giuliani and Chief Bratton broke the code in 1993. Rudy Giuliani came into a city that was in despair, that had tremendous problems. You can read about this, both in Giuliani's book, Leadership, and in Bratton's remarkable book, Turnaround. They started at the very basics. They went after everybody who was breaking the law. They went after every place that had a problem. And it's almost impossible to believe, but liberals resented the very programs that saved lives. Rudy Giuliani and Chief Bratton brought the murder rate in New York down from over 3,000 a year to about 500. It's a remarkable decrease. And it's a fact. It's not a theory. It's not somebody in some college classroom. And that process was continued under Mayor Bloomberg, and New York City became a remarkably safe city. Staten Island, population 600,000, may be the safest 600,000 population city in America. But that required the police having authority. It required the police employing what's called stop and frisk. If they suspect you, they stop and check you out. Liberals hated it. They hated the police being in charge. They hated the police being able to stop you. They preferred people getting killed to having an effective police force. The result's Chicago. So if you were to look at the current death rate in Chicago, compare it to what happened in New York, there would literally be several thousand people alive today in Chicago if they'd had the policing system that Giuliani and Bratton developed. It's not a secret. People know how to do it. Liberals don't want to do it. The result is people die. So where are we? You have liberals preferring the teachers' union over children getting an education. You have liberals preferring bureaucracy and red tape and high taxes over creating small businesses and jobs. You have liberals preferring to have an ineffective and crippled police force over saving lives. And that's why you have the problem we have today. It's frankly why I'm proud of Donald Trump's willingness to take a risk that no Republican in my lifetime has taken, to go into the inner city, to say he wants to help, he wants to break out, he wants to create safety, he wants to create jobs, he wants to create hope. Somebody has to do it, because these things aren't random, isolated things. You don't get Ferguson, Milwaukee, Charlotte, Baltimore without some deep underlying level of anger building across the whole country. And where's the anger building? It's building in cities that Democrats have dominated, in cities that have applied liberal policies, in cities where liberal special interest groups prop up the bureaucracies. And so the Democrats can't possibly fix this. And it's going to take courageous leadership by people who aren't owned by the interest groups and by people who aren't blinded by ideology to try to really change things. Mary Harris wrote, will our president address this to influence the group of rioters to realize their actions are a big part of the problem? I have no idea. My sense is that President Obama has tried to avoid being in the middle of this, which is really kind of strange. You'd think the President of the United States would notice if there were major riots in the largest city in North Carolina. Heather McCoy, we need to find a way to come together as a country, and our president should be taking the lead in this. Well, of course. And that's why I think electing Trump may really make a difference, because he's at least expressed a willingness to bring us together. Hillary's first reaction to this latest shooting was very divisive, because she takes the left-wing hardline view that if something bad happened, it must be the police's fault, which, as I said a while ago, goes all the way back to her career in law school. I think the important thing here is to recognize that the young lady who was so angry on television last night represents a real level of anger based on a real lifetime experience, and that we have an obligation to listen carefully to the concerns of the black community within a framework that says we're not going to tolerate riots, we're not going to tolerate looting, we are in fact going to enforce the law, and we're going to reinforce our police so that they have a greater ability to keep you alive. And I think that's got to be the framework within which we can have a conversation. But the conversation can't just be touchy-feely between the police and the community, which lots of people say, oh, gee, they ought to get together more. No. The conversation has to be, how do we create education so you can get a job? How do we create an environment where jobs and small businesses can be created so you can get a job? What do we do to make sure that your neighborhood is safe and is not dominated by pimps and drug dealers and violent people? Now, those are serious underlying social change, far more than just having one more meeting in the neighborhood to try to like each other. Kelly Lawrence says, is the system too big to fix? It sure seems that way. Well, the system is too big, too centralized in Washington, has too many bureaucrats and too much red tape. But the answer is to decentralize it, to get power back to the local community, and to develop positive job creation programs. Jack Kemp, former congressman from New York, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, presidential candidate, Kemp had a proposal for what he called enterprise zones. Imagine that we took the poorest section of every city in the country and we cut out the red tape, cut out the local taxes, cut out the federal taxes, and said, for the next 10 years, we're going to go all out to create jobs in this zone as long as the people in the zone get a first chance to get hired. Then you've got to look at education. We know that some of the most effective training programs to help people get jobs, to create career education opportunities, to create people, for example, who can take care of the windmill generators that we're creating, to create people who can take care of all sorts of internet capabilities, to create people who can take care of something as simple as plumbing. I mean, plumbers make a good bit of money, but how do you get the education to be a plumber? Well, tragically, we've seen the Washington bureaucracy undermine and try to destroy the very schools that are career education schools that serve these folks. We think that if you were to take the number of school slots that were available in 2009 for people to go out and learn a skill which would give them a good job with a good income, that 5 million students have been cut out by the Washington bureaucracy, crippling the ability to deliver this kind of learning. And we really believe you've got to look at the career education colleges and universities and the ability for these kind of schools to be very agile, to provide exactly the right training. So you want to become a nurse's assistant. Well, it can be done in a very timely way. It can save you a great deal of money because it gets you through the system and gets you back to work very quickly. But you've had a Washington bureaucracy which claims it's for jobs, but kills the very schools that try to train you so you could get the job. So we've had a lot of things that have gone wrong. We need an agenda for a prosperous, safe inner city. And I think that's the core of what we need to do. Whether it's Milwaukee, Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore, Charlotte, Ferguson, we need to think through how do we break out of the policies that don't work? How do we break out of the institutions that don't work? How do we break out of the special interests that have preferred to take care of themselves at the cost of the community? If we can develop that kind of program, then the problems we've seen in Charlotte and Milwaukee and elsewhere will be problems of the